Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Conlanging session. Hope you're all faring well in the midst of the current outbreak. Hope you're all staying safe and washing your hands and all that stuff. Another big thank you to all of the patrons. Some patrons have contacted me and withdrawn their pledge in light of the current epidemic, which is obviously completely justifiable and understandable. I'm not going to hold that against you at all. Take care of yourselves before you throw money at me. And on a lighter note, if you like this series, then you might be interested to know that David Peterson and Jesse Sams are hosting a similar series over on their channel Langtime Studios, in which they sit down and they make a conlang from scratch. Unlike me, however, they are doing their series weekly, I believe, and they're doing it live too, which a lot of people have asked me to make these videos live, which at this point I am not prepared to do, and I don't think I ever will, because, in case you didn't know, each of these videos, unedited, is about 5 hours long, and I edit it down to about 30 minutes, because almost the entirety of the parts that I cut out are just me staring blankly at the wall going, which I don't think is particularly riveting entertainment. And if I were streaming on top of that and simultaneously looking at what people were saying in the chat, then I just wouldn't be able to get anything done in any reasonable amount of time. Also, unlike me, David and Jesse actually have some idea what they're doing, and they've done this in a professional context. So I will link to their channel by whatever mechanism YouTube allows. So go and subscribe to them, and tell them I sent you. Right then. So, where were we? Well, first of all, just a couple items of follow-up from the last video. Number one, I made another error with the vowels. This way here shouldn't be way, it should be Also, another thing, when I copied over the sound chart, I copied the consonants, but not the vowels for some reason. So for the Proto-Lang, it's just a basic 3-vowel system. And then for the modern language, we have our very unusual 6-vowel system and the 2 underspecified vowels. And one last thing for phonology. In thinking more about how I want the language to sound, first of all, I didn't phrase this sound change very well. But also, I think I might go ahead and throw in another instance of metathesis, but this time with following liquids. Just because that kind of fits with the phone aesthetic I'm going for, and also because that would help make it distinct from some of my other languages. Like in Nakachti, there are no coda liquids, they just lengthen the preceding vowel, or turn into an O in the case of the L. I don't know if I'll necessarily have both instances of metathesis happen back-to-back like that. It could be that the language maybe just goes through a period where it decides it really doesn't like coda stops, and it just fixes it with pervasive metathesis. Or it could be that the liquid metathesis comes a bit later. I don't know. I'll decide that when we actually get to making phonological forms for words. Now, as for the grammar, I had something of a revelation while I was thinking about the Austronesian alignment system we might be going for. So you'll remember that what I was thinking of maybe doing is having a whole slew of valency changing operations that would let us jump whatever the relevant argument is to subject position to keep it as the topic. But while I was thinking about that and how that might work, I realized something. So with the verb system, as we've got it constructed at the moment, with these auxiliaries that derive from the copula, plus the lexical verb in the converb or participle form, what that basically evolved from is, if you imagine random example sentence off the top of my head, I saw my friend. So the way you'd construct that is, it's in the perfect, which would mean it would need a combination of the imperfective copula and the perfective converb. So it would be something like, I was being having seen my friend. Now, if we wanted to make that a passive then, if we passivized the main verb, if we passivized the copula, well, first of all, I'm not even sure if that's possible, but even if it was, I'm not sure that would actually make any sense. Because what we really want is to passivize the verb in the converb clause. We want to passivize the verb see. So that means then that the valency changing operations will get affixed onto the lexical verb rather than the auxiliary verbs. Now that actually has some pretty significant implications. So the way I had originally conceived of this working was that each lexical verb, all the verb entries in the dictionary, would have 3 distinct forms, and it would just be a matter of knowing which of those 3 forms to use based on which tense you were trying to render, and then the auxiliary would have all the other forms. But this then would mean that each of those 3 forms of the lexical verb will also need several different subforms for each of the different valency changing operations. But not only that, that will lead to a system that it's simultaneously very strange, but also not really that strange at all, depending on how you look at it. And to explain, let's say you had another random example sentence off the top of my head. I am eating an apple. So, the way you'd say that then, let's just go ahead and throw in case marking as well. So it would be I as the subject, then it would be the copula, the imperfective, and the copula would also be marked for the subject as well, in which case, if we're going prodrop, which we probably will, then the subject pronoun could be omitted. So that's I am being, and then apple. Also, yeah, I should say, I'm assuming that this is going to be V2, so I've put the auxiliary verb first, and then the last word would be the main verb, which is eat, also in the imperfective. So it's like, I am being while eating an apple. Okay, that's all well and good, but now if you imagine we say that the apple is the topic. If we want to put emphasis on the apple, so if we say like, an apple is being eaten by me. So the apple has been promoted to the subject, right? So it's now in the nominative. And the tense hasn't changed, so the auxiliary will still be the imperfective copula, but this time, because the apple is now the subject, the auxiliary agrees with the apple, so third person singular, and if we are going to do a gender distinction, then it would have inanimate or whatever other gender we might use, and then it would be the first person singular pronoun in some sort of oblique case or instrumental or whatever case the passive assigns to the agent, and then the passive goes on the lexical verb at the very end of the sentence. So it's like, an apple, it is being, while eaten by me. Now, if we analyze this in the, I guess, traditional way, that's not strange at all. That's just an auxiliary verb construction with the copula, and the passive goes on the lexical verb. That's really not very odd. But if this is used pervasively, if this is a standard thing, and if we were analyzing this through the lens of Austronesian alignment / trigger systems, then what we basically have is there are 2 verbal elements. One of them comes with a marker that tells you the person, number, and gender of the topic, and the other one comes with a marker that tells you what case the topic is in. Because that's basically what the passive does, right? Because it's just essentially a signal that whatever the syntactic subject is filling the role of a patient. So it's this kind of strange system where the agreement elements are kind of spread across the entire sentence. And on top of that, with the way the tense system works, you'd need both verbal elements to figure out what tense the sentence was in as well. I do actually really quite like that. Now, the only issue with this system is, ironically, the entire reason why I introduced the idea of using Austronesian alignment in the first place is to use it as a way to make more forms for the auxiliary to make it more phonologically varied. But if all the valency changing operations are going to be happening on the lexical verb anyway, then actually that doesn't affect the auxiliary at all. So then, it's basically back to square one. I toyed around with the idea of using switch reference last time, but that opens up a whole bunch of other stuff that I'd rather not get into because it would get overly complicated. So no switch reference. Which means that basically the only system of anaphora we have left is gender. Also, another thing that a couple of commenters pointed out that we can put on the auxiliary verb is modal stuff, things like optatives and abilitives and all that stuff, including, something I completely forgot about, evidentiality. That remains an option, and in fact, that reminds me of something. I don't know why that didn't occur to me sooner, but if you've seen my evidentiality video, you'll know that there are basically two sources for evidential morphology. One is from a lexical source that has to do with whatever source of evidence the evidential is signaling. So verbs like to see or to hear or to feel or things like that. But the other is to have the evidential evolve from repurposed tense morphology, especially perfects or perfectives or resultatives or things like that. So in our case, here, I remember struggling to decide exactly what to do with these two, the subjunctive and the conditional. Could it be possible that one of them could have an evidential encoding? So here we said that the subjunctive comes from the old future, and the conditional was a future in the past. Those do make sense to me. So the idea was that the locative copula, which came from the verb that means to stand, gets used as an auxiliary that encodes the future. Alternatively, the standard copula was used to convey the continuous aspect. So combining with the perfect got a past continuous encoding, which then became the remote past. Could we potentially say that once the imperfective converb got introduced, the old form lost its continuous aspect and therefore just became a sort of generic past tense thing, which, when the new perfect was introduced, got interpreted as an indirect past tense marker? Maybe? I mean, if I ended up doing that, then I would say that the past habitual would also be used as a remote past, or maybe instead group the remote past with the experiential? You know, the more I think about it, the more I like that idea. I think I might just go ahead and do it. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with that. And while I'm at it, I might want to switch the habitual and the present, just because I think it might be more symmetrical if the old continuous just became a default present, and then the imperfective added a habitual interpretation. Yeah, why not? I'll go ahead and do that. So I specifically don't want to go animate and inanimate, because I've done that a lot. And also the fact that in these sorts of systems, more often than not, the animate ends up as the topic anyway. Sometimes the topic can only be animate. So I'd rather divide the animate into subdivisions if I can. The obvious subdivisions are masculine, feminine, and neuter, but that's a bit boring and arbitrary. Could go with human and non-human, See, in Okalawak, I had the kind of animacy hierarchy type thing. So for that, it was going from most animate to least animate. It was humans, inanimates, and abstractions. And I quite liked that system. So for a minimalist system, I could do human and non-human. To go one step further, I could add inanimate. I could divide inanimates into objects. I don't know, I'm really torn, because I either want quite a small system with only 2 or 3 genders, or I want a really big system with like 10, 11, 12 genders, like the Bantu languages. I mean, if I want to maximize phonological variation, it would make sense to go with lots of genders. I don't know. Another thing for the list of things to think about later. In the meantime, something else to consider is more modal stuff. So if we look at these example sentences again, how would someone say something like, I can eat an apple, or I am able to eat an apple? Now, we could very easily justify the modal as coming on the lexical verb as well, so it would be like, I am, while being able to eat an apple. But I think we could equally justify it going on the copula. Like, if the copula construction is already established, and then you add a lexical verb, like to be able to, then I can see that glomming onto the copula. Alternatively, we could say that maybe the modal verb itself stands on its own as an auxiliary, independent of the copula construction. So instead, it would be the exact same thing, except take out the copula and replace it with whatever the modal auxiliary is. But that would mean then, because for the tense encodings, we're using 2 different verbs, the locative copula and the standard copula. If there were modal verbs involved, unless we just wanted to do rampant suppletion, which would be a little bit weird, then any given modal verb would have a reduced set of tenses it would convey. That's a possibility, but I think I just prefer the idea of them getting glommed onto the copula. So what sort of modal stuff can we include? Because we've already got the subjunctive as part of the tense system itself, and the conditional as well. So we could have a separate potential, maybe, which is a little bit similar to the subjunctive and conditional, but without the sort of irrealisness. Or if we didn't want to call it potential, it could be called like abilitative or abilitive. And then we could have an obligative or necessitative or whatever you want to call it for things that need to happen, and an optative as well, which along with the indicative is basically exactly what Nakashti does. Oh, but hang on, what about imperatives? How is this language going to handle imperatives? Because if we go back to the proto-language, would the proto-language have made aspectual distinctions in the imperative? Like, would it be possible to have a continuous imperative? So usually the imperative doesn't have as many tense distinctions as verbs in the indicative. And you can kind of see why. Like, it's sort of weird to give a command to someone for something to happen in the past. So if we did say that the proto-language let the copular auxiliaries be used in imperative constructions, then I would imagine whatever the imperative affix auxiliary thing is would go on the copula. But it doesn't really make sense that it would go with the locative copula, because the locative copula is used for the future, and technically could have a future imperative, but That is weird. So that means that only certain tenses would be compatible with the imperative, and it would only go with certain forms. It wouldn't go with the locative copula at all. Alternatively, if we said that the proto-language doesn't allow the copula construction in imperatives, and imperatives don't distinguish aspect, then that means that the imperative would go onto the lexical verb. And that would mean that there's a fourth form for the lexical verb. You'd have the three ones that are involved in making tense aspect distinctions, and then you'd have a separate imperative one. That's kind of an interesting idea. And a third option would just be to say that the imperative is just encoded by using a second person form, which happens sometimes, and then the first and third person can sometimes be used for things like, I think it's called a cohortative or a jussive, like let's do something. Even though I am looking for more forms for the auxiliary, in imperative constructions, if we go with option 2 and say that the imperative is marked on the lexical verb, that means in imperative constructions the auxiliary wouldn't be used at all, which means that it almost doesn't really matter that we've added an extra form to the lexical verb. So I think I am actually leaning towards the second option. I think I'm going to add an extra form to the lexical verb. So I'm going to take the imperatives and put them down here, and we'll get back to that in a little bit, once I think more about modal stuff. Of course, another thing to think about, as I mentioned before, evidentiality. We've already got one indirect perfect there, and an interesting, important thing to note is that if we're doing it like that, the indirect form doesn't have a continuous aspect. It's just a simple past with the indirect interpretation. So something interesting could be done with that, maybe. So we'd obviously have first hand, because that's kind of the default. And then we've got our indirect in the actual tense system itself. But how would that jive with other evidentials? Because if we had evidentials like visual versus non-visual, or if we broke it down even further than that, let's just say we had an auditory as well, would the non-visual and auditory only be compatible with the indirect perfect? Sort of like a means to clarify exactly how the unseen information was known? Or would they be applied to all tense and aspects, and the indirect perfect would just be a generic sort of catch-all for unseen stuff that happened in the past? Well, in that sort of construction, let's say we had a sentence like, he went home. So it would be, he was in the perfect, go in the infinitive, and then home. And then originally that meant something like, he was going home, which became the default past tense, which then gained a sort of resultative encoding and then became the indirect perfect. So then, let's say, just for the sake of example, that we had an auditory evidential evolve. The auditory evidential would probably come from a verb that means something like to hear. One option would be to say that there is an entire phrase in there, like, I hear that, and that precedes this clause. So it's like, I hear that he went home, and then over time, I hear that gets glommed onto the verb to become an auditory evidential. And if that's the case, that would be compatible with any of the tenses. And also, if we correct the syntax, if we are saying it was originally robustly head final, then it would be he, home, go, was. Well, then we could say this phrase, since it's technically the primary verb of the sentence, would go at the very end, and that means it would get suffixed to the auxiliary, which is good. That's exactly what we want. So that means we can justify the evidentials as coming on the auxiliary. So which ones do I actually want to use? Actually, another interesting thing might be to have a separate dubitative, or dubitative, or however you pronounce it, and maybe a mirative to go with it, because usually, again, if you've seen my video on evidentiality, these two moods kind of overlap with evidentials a lot of the time. It suddenly occurs to me that I don't think I have any conlangs that have a pervasive system of evidentiality. The closest I have is Negation, because Negation has a basic direct versus indirect system in the past tenses. So that might be cool to do with this language. That's something new that I haven't properly done before. But how far do I want to go with it is the question. I might get rid of the sensory ones and just stick with these. And the mirative, I might just do what I've seen most evidential languages do, which is to use the evidentials with a first person to express mirativity. And then there's the issue of negation and interrogatives. So with negation, it always depends on what exactly is being negated. That's why, like in the Thracian languages, like Nakachti and Aedun, the main method of negation is to use a negative verb, like in Finnish. But there's also a separate negative prefix that can kind of jump around and can be applied to any word in a sentence to negate that specific element. So let's say we wanted to negate the sentence, he went home. Ignoring the evidential for now, let's get rid of that. Let's just say, he was going home. Then where would the negative go? If we put it on the auxiliary verb, it would be, he was not to go home. And if we put it on the lexical verb, it would be, he was to not go home. Both of those would mean pretty much the same thing. I think the default would be that the negative affix would go on the auxiliary to negate the whole sentence, and then if you wanted to, there would be a separate negative that would go on the lexical verb. I think that makes sense to me. So there will definitely be some sort of negative form for the auxiliary. And as for interrogatives, so what immediately comes to mind is to use a question particle, and usually in verb initial languages, the question particle comes first. It's usually the first word in the sentence, and for verb final languages, it's the last word in the sentence. And then if we wanted to, we could have question particle just glom on to the word it was next to, like the auxiliary, for example, to give us an interrogative form of the auxiliary. I mean, that would be pretty easy and uncontroversial to do, I think. Alternatively, it does strike me that since we do have pervasive mandatory auxiliary constructions all over the place, we could do what English does and do subject auxiliary inversion. But honestly, I still don't really understand the diachronic motivation for that, or how that comes about. And while I do think it would be cool, I think it would be a lot safer and easier to go with the former option. So some sort of either word final interrogative particle, or just to glom it onto the auxiliary. So where would the negative be placed then? If it's a negative verb, like it is in Nakachti or Aedun or the other Thracian languages, then it would probably be the last word in the sentence, and then it would just get glommed in with all the auxiliaries that came before it. But if it's a negative adverb, then it would typically follow the same order as adjective and noun. So it would precede whatever it was negating, in this case, because we're working with head final. So that means we'd have a negative prefix. Alright, I'm good with that. So let me actually take all of this and start roughing out a sort of verb template. So we've got the verb stem, and then these ones, these modals. So if you wanted to say, I am able to eat an apple, I guess it would be I can be eating an apple, if you wanted to preserve the continuousness of it. It sounds really clunky in English. So in the proto-language, it would be I, apple, eat. but it's in the continuous, so it would have the copula, and then it would need can or be able to, or what have you. But if you wanted to make that past tense, I was able to eat an apple. So what I'm basically getting at is, would the perfect marking go on the auxiliary or the lexical verb? Would it be, I was able, am eating an apple? Or would it be, I can, was eating an apple? I think it would go on the auxiliary. It would go on the modal, right? So that means for these then, these modals, they would come after the stem, but they would be the forms that would be conjugated in the perfect. Yes, and we said the perfective was formed through reduplication. So that means if any of these are present, those affixes will be reduplicated in the perfective tenses. And then the stem, essentially, what was either the copula or the locative copula, would just sort of become a prefix onto the beginning of those. But the evidentials, on the other hand, they work differently because they come from an entire phrase. And the evidential phrase always comes after the, I guess, the semantic phrase. So the evidentials would be suffixes. There is no specific first-hand form since that's the default, but we'd have our reportative, our inferential, our dubitative, and maybe our mirative as well. And then negation would come in the form of a prefix because it comes from a negative adverb. And the interrogative would be a suffix at the end of all of that. There we go. One kind of verb template. Oh, wait, no, I forgot. Subject marking. Subject marking. We've got to make sure we've got subject marking in there as well. So I'm thinking that the subject pronouns will only become incorporated into the verb complex kind of late in the language's history after all of this other stuff. Maybe subject marking only becomes a thing once V2 word order is established. So then we would have the subject as a prefix onto the auxiliary. So there we go. That is our kind of rough guide for the structure of the auxiliary verbs. Okay, so on to the lexical verb forms. What we have established so far, we have 4 different forms of every lexical verb. We've got the so-called infinitive, we've got the so-called perfective converb, and the so-called imperfective converb. I say so-called because I'm not actually totally sure what the proper terminology will be. It almost doesn't really matter at this point. But now we've decided also have a separate imperative. And the imperative does not convey any tense or aspect information. And then each of those forms will be complemented with different forms for each of the valency changing operations that are used to shuffle around the arguments to get the topic to the subject. So following on from last time, there is the passive. That one seems pretty uncontroversial. Now, a couple of commenters pointed me towards something I had not heard of before, called a circumstantial voice, which is, from what I gather, a valency changing operation that promotes an oblique argument to the role of the subject. Now that sounds ideal, and I'd really like to use one of those. Unfortunately, I can find frustratingly little information about the circumstantial voice. Just about the only thing I found is that it's in Malagasy, and I did some digging through some reference grammars, and information about its exact use, and especially its diachronics, is really, really scant, which is unfortunate. So in lieu of that, we could just do what I did in Okalawak, and use the passive in combination with the applicatives. The most common applicative is the benefactive, so we'd probably have that. In Ukalawak, there's a separate comitative applicative, but very often the instrumental and the comitative are the same thing, or similar. And then a locative. So there are a handful of languages that I found that have more specific applicatives, like Ubich has an ablative and translocative applicatives. Ah yes, and I mentioned last time that I had this vague, nebulous memory of a genitive applicative, which some people did point out was probably the so-called possessive voice in Wolof, which, yes, I think that probably was what I was thinking of. And I learned about this voice that I've never heard of before, called the adjutative or adjutative, I don't know. But apparently the adjutative is used to mean that the subject helped the object to accomplish the verb. So if you take the phrase, I see you, and then if you put it in the adjutative, it would mean, I help you to see. Or I guess, I help you to see it. So it essentially adds another argument. It's kind of like a causative in that sense. Speaking of which, what are we doing about causatives? Well, going back to our example sentences, if we say, he went home, to causativize that, causative adds another argument, so it would be like, I made him go home. So in the proto-lang, I guess it would technically be, I made him going home. So if the copular auxiliary is being used, then what happens if a causative gets involved? Well, if we say it came from a verb that means, let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, cause, so it would be the same thing as it would be for the modals, right? Cause is the new main verb, or is it that the auxiliary verb is being put into the continuous? Like, I was causing him to go home, versus I cause him to be going home. So, these forms, like, they evolved from separate clauses, right? So if we wanted to do a present tense sentence like, I make him go home, then the equivalent way of saying that would be, I am while making him go home, right? Because if you think about how these things evolved, so let's say you had some random sentence like, I am eating dinner while working. So this whole tense system, these constructions evolved, and the object of the first clause was dropped. So it would just become, I am while working, right? So the while clause needs to make internal sense. Because if you apply the causative to the auxiliary, it would be, I am causing while he goes home. I don't know, to me it sounds a lot more natural to be, I am while making him go home. The causative needs to have an object in the same clause, right? I don't know. To me, it just makes more intuitive sense that the causative would go on the lexical verb, like the other valency changing things. And the adjutative would be the same thing. So it would be like, I am while helping him see it. So the subject of the first clause will need to be the same as the subject as the second clause, which actually, now that I think about it, will be another use for all of these various valency changing operations. So you can keep the converb clause and the main clause congruent with each other. So surely then, the causative would have to go on the lexical verb, right? I am while causing him to go home. Because I am the subject of both clauses. Surely that makes sense, right? Whereas with the modals, that's not an issue, because if we say he went home, if we change that to he needed to go home, then need would become the main auxiliary, so it would be he needed to be going home. So the to be would still apply to the to go, not to the need. I think that makes sense. Maybe? You know what? I have rambled on for ages now, and I have thoroughly confused myself, so I think I'm going to leave it there. So let me know in the comments below if what I've done makes any sense to anyone else. Let me know if you think the causative should go on the auxiliary or the lexical verb. I'm going to go away and have a good, long, hard think about that. And hopefully, by the next time I do one of these, we can actually move on to finalizing some of these decisions I've been toying with. And another thing I have to think about is how these valency changing operations relate to the case system and what sorts of cases I'd like to have involved. Thank you very much for watching and sticking around to the end, and I will hopefully see you for the next one. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.